Thanks. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Josh, for facilitating the invitation, and to the entire Latin American Studies community for hosting me. Thanks to Bill and to Ken for your leadership in Latin American Studies. It was really a delight to meet with the graduate student community and postgraduate student community today. I'm really impressed with the intellectual community that exists here, and I think that's incredibly important. So thanks for asking me to be part of it. What I'm going to share with you today is really new territory for me. For the last many years, I have been focused on Chile and the Cold War. So a first project looking at the contentious debates about socialist democracy under Allende, then a second project about military dictatorship and its transnational connections to the United States. But now I've jumped out of the 20th century completely into the arguably much more contentious, fractious, and violent 19th century and its debates over freedom and nation. I'm now happily trespassing on new historiographies, both on Peru and also on China. And I have re-angled my gender analysis from an original focus on women workers to a focus now on men. But I would say that there's a continuity between these projects, which is my abiding interest in agrarian labor struggles and the politics of gender. All right? So I'm committed to denaturalizing the lives of peasants and plantation workers, and to rendering more visible the political nature of rural violence and gendered hierarchies, both among men as well as between men and women. So this is a project much more focused on masculinity, but that doesn't mean it's not situated within patriarchy. Nonetheless, there's a rich irony to this new project. I am essentially working on a history of men and war. And that is a topic that feminist historians like myself have worked really hard to decenter. And I'm working on a particular war, the War of the Pacific, which is a conflict through which Chile annexes large swaths of Peru and Bolivia and becomes Chile. It acquires nitrate and copper, which will, give rise to Chile's famous militant working classes, but also to myths of Chilean national superiority over its neighbors. For Chile, the War of the Pacific territorially and ideologically does very much the same work for race and nation that the US-Mexican War does for the United States. In fact, when I first went to Chile as a graduate student at the end of the Pinochet dictatorship to study peasant movements in the agrarian reform, the only people who were working on the War of the Pacific were right-wing apologists for military rule. And it's still a topic, present company excluded, that most progressive-minded social historians of Chile avoid, despite the fact that this war is really crucial to the making of not only modern Chile, but modern Peru and Bolivia. And despite the fact that the legacies of this war continue to produce really acute geopolitical and racial tensions to this day. Bolivia just sued Chile in the International Court in The Hague unsuccessfully for access to the sea, which is something that it lost in this war. If you go to Lima today, what is most kind of astonishing about multinational corporate presence are not US corporations, but Chilean corporations, Falabella, Movistar, various Chilean companies, etc. Contrary to all the talk about Venezuelan migration everywhere because of the crisis in Venezuela, one of the largest groups of migrants in South America today are Bolivians and Peruvians in Chile. So, whatever, all of these dynamics are connected in different ways to this war. Now, my own interest is really not in the war per se. Rather, I'm interested in the importance of Chinese labor in the making of modern South America. And that's a topic that I've come to through teaching world history at UC Irvine, including teaching the history of China in relationship to various histories of Latin America. It's also a project I've arrived at through my own students in Irvine who take my Latin American history classes. Students who often have a grandparent or great-grandparent who came to the United States not from China, not first through New York or San Francisco, but rather through first generational stays in Lima or Havana or Chinese communities in Hermosillo, Mexico. Latin American studies as a field has long ignored Asians, and it's been very complicit in affirming nationalist myths of mestizaje that intentionally rejected Asians. We've long thought internationally, and now transnationally, about Latin America as part of an Atlantic world, but the work I'm doing in this project is interested in asking what Latin America looks like when we see it as part of a Pacific world, when we take seriously Latin America's long historic connections with China in this case, and Latin America's constitution by Chinese people from within its borders. Okay, so let me tell you something about stories of massacre. By all accounts, the year 1881 was a year of horrific violence against Chinese communities living in Peru. The War of the Pacific was in full swing, a conflict that pitted an invading Chilean army against Peru and Bolivia in a struggle over the nitrate-rich Atacama Desert. In mid-January 1881, Chilean troops seized control of Lima after 2 bloody battles that left a staggering 15,000 people dead and commenced what became Chile's 3-year occupation of Peru and permanent annexation of territory. According to multiple stories circulated at the time, following Peru's defeat, but before Chileans entered the city, Chinese shopkeepers in Lima were attacked by 1,000 Peruvian soldiers and mobs of Black women and cholos, a category signifying mixed-race people. Some reported as many as 300 Chinese murdered in a single day, and Lima's entire Chinese district burnt to the ground. A month later, in February 1881, similar stories claimed that over 1,000 Chinese coolie laborers were slaughtered in Cañete, an agricultural valley dominated by sugar plantations. This massacre also reportedly happened on a single day at the hands of Blacks and Cholos, with especially brutal acts by Black women. These stories about anti-Chinese violence have received little commentary by historians of Peru and Chile. This silence reflects Latin America's long neglect of Asian immigrants, and as I said, our participation in reifying official stories about racial hybridity that exclude Asians and that also exclude African descendant people. Most scholarship on the War of the Pacific emphasizes national tragedies about whites and Indians, Peruvian oligarchs who betray their indigenous guerrilla forces, vaguely Europeanized Chilean imperialists who attack fractured and weak Andean states. Pushed out of the frame is the fact that by 1880, almost 90% of all plantation labor in Peru are Chinese men, some 120,000 of whom are brought through the coolie trade on 8-year indenture contracts to replace African slaves. Chinese merchants, most of whom arrive as coolies, comprised the largest group of foreigners in Lima and ran provision stores up and down the Peruvian coast. African descendant Peruvians also labored on plantations as debt peons and artisans, but since emancipation in 1854, most Black people eked out livings as peasants on marginal lands or worked as day laborers in nearby towns. Lima's population was almost 30% Black, and across the Peruvian coast, it was up to 50% African descendant. The Chinese population was almost entirely male, since women comprise less than 1% of those trafficked as coolies. However, conjugal unions, common law marriages, between free Chinese men and local Black and indigenous women were common. During the War of the Pacific, Chileans, Peruvians, and Chinese all wrote about anti-Chinese violence, much of it involving Black people, as integral parts of the conflict. Such narratives included newspapers, diplomatic reports, war memoirs, and letters. Today, I examine the multivocal and contested nature of these stories about Chinese massacre. I ask what political purpose they served, and I trace their larger claims about gender, race, and nation. I argue that stories of Chinese massacre were key to how Chileans, Peruvians, and Chinese men themselves strategically positioned themselves in the war. They alternately defended or decried such things as the legitimacy of Chile's occupation, the fitness of Peru as a republic, and the place of Black and Chinese people within it. I'm also interested in how narratives of Chinese massacre served as cover stories for other violence, such as Chilean massacres of Peruvians, new forms of trafficking Chinese labor, Peruvian elites' collaboration with Chile, and the disqualification of Black people as Peruvian patriots. Inevitably, of course, today I'm going to create my own narrative of Chinese massacre, and I'm posing my own logic about what happened and why. I'm interested in using narrative methodology to elaborate a material history of violence. This puts traditions of Latin American labor history into dialogue with Asian American studies and feminist scholarship on how gender and race shape national belonging. I particularly build on the new exciting transnational work from Latin Americanists like Jason Chang and Elliot Young, who powerfully argue that anti-Chinese racism was central to the construction of Latin American citizenship. I also look to the interdisciplinary American studies work of folks like Moon Ho Young and Lisa Yun, who've explored how the discursive figure of the coolie was central to 19th century debates about freedom. Now, Chinese experience in Peru is not reducible to racism. And as Adam McCowan and Gary Okahiro cautioned us both, exclusive focus on racism and violence can reinscribe the trope of the Chinese as the forever global pariah. However, bringing racial conflict into focus can also explode simple logics about violence as some kind of natural outcome of structural competition or an ever-pervasive xenophobia. I argue here that both rural and urban violence against Chinese men in Peru emerged from political struggles over Peru's plantation system and the meaning of coolie labor. Chile's invasion of Peru exploded existing racial and class conflicts within Peru, wherein both Chinese men and African descendant Peruvians challenged the power of Peru's white oligarchy, but from positions that were often at times in tragic, lethal conflict. So let me start with the stories about massacre in Lima. Chilean accounts were written by Chilean war journalists who accompanied the troops and who later edited the occupation newspapers in Lima. These stories were recycled and embellished by Chilean literati, such as the Chilean historian Diego Barros Arana, who famously described the Lima massacre as follows. A drunken horde of Peruvian soldiers and Black women threw themselves upon the small grocery shops of the unarmed Asiatics, blasting off doors with rifle shots shots or chopping them to pieces, and then looting and setting the shops ablaze. From there, they went to the large stores that sell jewels, fine fabric, and art. Of all the enterprise of the Chinese nation, only smoking and bloody ruins remain, since robbery and arson necessarily led to the murder of those unhappy Chinos who tried to save their property. No less than 300 Asiatics were immolated in the streets and neighboring farms. Chileans argued that Peruvians killed Chinese men in revenge for Chinese support to the Chilean army. And in fact, thousands of Chinese coolies did take advantage of Chile's invasion to rebel against masters and flee plantations. At least 2,000 Chinese became formally attached to the Chilean army during the battles for Lima. They served as guides, detonated landmines, operated ambulances, and hauled food and ammunition. In newspaper stories circulated before and after the fall of Lima, Chileans fashioned themselves as enlightened liberators of Chinese slaves, vanquishing backward and dishonorable Peruvian tyrants. Chilean stories about Chinese massacre in Lima reiterated Chilean claims of masculine and racial superiority. They staged the collapse of Peru's national integrity in tales about out-of-control Black women who engulfed defeated Peruvian soldiers into a crazed horde of Black revolt. The war correspondent for the Valparaíso El Heraldo, this man, Daniel Riquelme, reported, quote, Black women and soldiers screaming, "Death to the gringos, death to the Chinos," before they fell on their Chinese victims. Here, the term gringo, a Spanish term for foreigner that usually meant Europeans and Anglo-Americans, now signaled Chilean membership in the international community of civilized white men. Chileans invoked the mutilated bodies of Chinese men as justification for their continued occupation. The occupation newspaper La Situación warned, quote, if Chilean troops withdraw from Peru, it will condemn all honorable people to death because the African rubbish of Black communism will return to the boiling point with negras, zambas, and mulatas as bloodthirsty as soldiers. In other words, Chilean men rescued helpless Chinese men and protected civilization from savage Black women. Peruvian stories about attacks on Chinese dismissed the idea that Chileans liberated or protected anyone, but they did reproduce the idea of the revenge thesis. Tomás Caivano, the founder of Lima's newspaper La Patria, specified that the violence against Lima's Chinese was started by Peruvian soldiers, or sailors rather, from Callao, who rushed to defend Lima. But upon arriving in Lima, they learned that Peru's supreme leader, Nicolás de Pierola, and his top generals had fled the coast for the mountains. With no one to lead them, the demoralized soldiers and the lowest rabble of the city faithfully turned on Chile's Chinese friends who had so betrayed Peru. Now, Caivano's criticism of Nicolás Pierola, he's the president, but he called himself the supreme leader. His criticism of Pierola's failure to defend the capital is shared by Peru's landed oligarchy, which considers Pierola a dictator and a rabble-rouser who curried favor with Blacks and Indians to circumvent their own power as oligarchs. Pierola had seized power in a coup at the beginning of the war and closed Congress. He called himself the protector of the race, which formally meant Indians, but often had wider meanings. Pierola enjoyed wide support among Afro-Peruvians, appointed many as provincial military leaders, and charged them with punishing landowners who opposed his authority and refused to fund his army. The Peruvian statesman Mariano Paz Soldan insisted that it was Chileans who were the real thieves and murderers, and that stories of Chinese massacre were the invention of Chilean writers. Paz Soldan argued that what damage had happened was the result of the Chinese themselves. He said that Chilean officers ordered their 3,000 Chinese agents, perpetrators of espionage and devastation, to go to Lima to wreak havoc and thereby give Chile an excuse to occupy the city on the lie that it had been sacked by its own people. Now, there's no evidence for the cynical claim that the violence in Lima was about Chinese attacking themselves. However, Paz Soldan's critique of Chilean propaganda was very incisive. He pointed out that Chilean stories of Peruvians massacring Chinese functioned as a cover story for Chileans' own war crimes, namely the Chilean army's massacre of some 800 civilians and surrendered Peruvian soldiers in the town of Chorrillos, 2 days before the attacks in Lima. Chilean sources corroborate this violence. There are many Chilean stories that admit that Chilean soldiers, mad with hunger and thirst, went house by house in Chorrillos, bayoneting survivors, setting wounded Peruvian soldiers on fire, gang raping women, and killing scores of fellow Chileans killing each other in fights over liquor before burning down the entire place. Chileans confessed to their own tragic excess in Chorrillos, but they morally exculpated themselves by offering more abundant and parallel stories about Black women and cholos massacring Chinese in Lima. So they invoked a generalized climate of brutality in which Peruvian depravity was yet more damning. And then there's a Chinese story about what happened. In July 1881, so 6 months after the massacre, the Lima-based merchants, Jim Yuting, Pie Ponki, Jitsong, and Quen Tong, sent a letter and a meticulously itemized list to the British ambassador Spencer St. John, wherein the Chinese specified that 8 Chinese had been killed in Lima, 12 stores were burned, and an astonishing 301 businesses were looted, with total damages of almost 400,000 pounds sterling. This is the largest financial claim in the war. The Chinese also reported simultaneous attacks and deaths of Chinese in the towns of Callao, Trujillo, and Cañete. By this accounting, the plunder of Chinese business had been enormous and national in scope up and down the coast. Numerous Chinese were killed defending their property or intentionally murdered. However, Chilean reports of the Barrio Chino being burnt to the ground and the slaughter of 300 Chinese were untrue. The Chinese merchants made no mention of Black people or outrageous acts by Black women. Instead, they were adamant that the attack was led by Peruvian army officers and built on a much longer history of abuse by Peruvian police and other authorities who regularly stole from Chinese merchants and forcibly impressed Chinese shopkeepers into servile work, such as sweeping sewage and collecting dead bodies, punishing them like coolies when they refused, whipping them, cutting men's queues, and putting them in cages. Once war with Chile began, assaults on Chinese property and persons escalated, made worse by a disastrous currency devaluation that caused merchants of all nationalities to close their shops, inviting further retaliation. Chinese shops were targeted, given the virulent racism and fact that they were concentrated in food sales. Although, interestingly, most of the 300 plus Chinese businesses that are sacked in January belong to former coolies and are very humble establishments. These are restaurant stands, fruit carts, small grocery stores. Only a handful of Chinese businesses are large firms from Hong Kong run by businessmen who actually arrive as businessmen. So an important point I want to make is this category of Chinese merchant is not separate from the category of Chinese coolie. It's completely fluid socially and certainly in terms of its political meaning in Peru as well. Chinese men insisted that they had defended themselves, Yu Tings and his colleagues detailed Chinese participation in a volunteer foreign militia called the Urban Guard, which organized in December 1880 to protect property and lives as Peruvian police were recommissioned to go to the front to fight the Chileans. Of the Urban Guard's 3,000 members, Chinese men constituted the second largest contingent after Italians. They were armed with revolvers, knives, and rifles. They fought in British-led squadrons, similar to British colonial practice elsewhere. But Chinese merchants underscored that it was they who restored order to Lima, not the Chileans. This points to a story that is almost entirely occluded by narratives of Chinese massacre in Lima, and that's the story of the Peruvians who died in the violence. Chinese, Peruvian, and British sources all note that the Urban Guard, this foreign militia, quelled rioting by shooting participants on site and serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Initial newspaper claims that 200 Peruvian communists were killed are not reliable. But European and Chilean sources both reported the execution of at least 20 Peruvian officers by the Urban Guard and prolonged gunfire that left as many as 80 Peruvian bodies littered about the Chinese district. Whatever the exact death toll, it's likely that more Peruvians than Chinese died during the violence. And given heavy Chinese participation in the Urban Guard, that Peruvians, women and men, died at Chinese hands. This is not to suggest that Chinese men were perpetrators rather than victims of racialized violence. Peruvians attacked Chinese people and property. Chinese men defended themselves. But the suppressed story about dead Peruvians challenges the racist and self-serving narrative of Chileans as well as of Peruvian oligarchs, and it renders a much more complex picture of Chinese insertion into Peruvian society. Now, Black women likely were part of the assailants who attacked Chinese men, given that Lima's population had a large Black population, and most importantly, by January 1881, since all the men are at the front, the civilian population is overwhelmingly female. Peruvian soldiers who returned from the disastrous battles with Chile included large numbers of Black soldiers who had just witnessed 10,000 comrades slaughtered, and they may indeed have acted in outrage at having just seen some Chinese assisting the Chilean army. However, Peruvian violence in Lima against the Chinese focused on seizing food and merchandise, not mass murder of Chinese neighbors or raising the barrio chino. Instead, Peruvian soldiers and poor people, enabled by Peruvian officers and the well-established pattern of official violence against Chinese persons, plundered Chinese enterprises, killing numerous Chinese people, and were themselves killed in even larger numbers by a foreign militia commanded by Europeans and including Chinese men. Okay, now I'm going to jump to Cañete, 50 miles south of Lima, where much more horrific carnage involving Chinese victims begins in February 1881. On the Casablanca sugar plantation in February 1881, an argument between Peruvian and Chinese participants at a carnival celebration exploded into violence that lasted 4 months and left over 1,000 Chinese plantation workers dead. The Chilean military reported rescuing 2,000 Chinese survivors in June and playing the role of Moses, marching them to safety in an exodus to the Chilean-occupied port of Pisco, a little bit further south. Now, there are far fewer stories about massacre in Cañete than there are stories about massacre in Lima. Chilean newspapers noted the mass killings as a minor detail in their larger occupation. Early historians of the war say nothing about it at all. A single Peruvian narrative, published in 1891 by the celebrated author, Peruvian author, Juan de Arona, as part of a longer history of immigration and argument for bringing over more Northern Europeans, has provided the basis for what little scholarship in our time exists. Juan de Arona was the pen name for Pedro Paz Soldan, a nephew of that other guy, Mariano Paz Soldan, and an owner of this plantation, very much impacted by the violence. Juan de Arona portrayed the bloodshed in Cañate as a race and class war in which Black peasants savaged Chinese workers as part of a larger attack on white political power and Peruvian modernity. His narrative is saturated in racist and misogynist hyperbole that reflects the widely held view of Peru's oligarchy that African-descendant people were inherently unfit as Peruvians. De Arona described Black men hacking Chinese men to pieces with machetes and offering quicker deaths by gunshot if the victim paid. Black women, who he said were the concubines of the Chinese, fought among themselves for the entertainment of mutilating the genitals on Chinese corpses. He wrote, quote, hordes of negros and cholos set fire to cane fields, destroyed sugar refineries, and in the patios of the great houses, the modern wonders of South America, Chinese bodies were piled up along with fine furniture and set ablaze in an auto-da-fe. Juan de Arona made almost no mention of the war with Chile. Instead, he blamed the slaughter on the resentment of manumitted slaves, who now lived as parasites and refused to work. Apocalyptically, he concluded that Cañate's Black Revolt was part of a, quote, long tradition of African savagery directed not only against Asiatics, but against whites, against property, against all civilization, unquote. Recently, the historian Vincent Peloso has offered a critical rereading of the Cañate massacre, for which he blames the Chilean army for refusing to send troops immediately until Peruvian landowners actually pay the Chileans to go there in June. Peloso argues that the central racial dynamic of the Cañate violence reflected Black people's claim to Peruvian Creole nationalism. As his argument goes, amid a war that mercilessly assaulted Peruvian sovereignty, killing Chinese foreigners demonstrated Black honor and patriotism. Peloso's argument is suggestive of Jason Chang's discussion of the grotesque assembly, mass acts of anti-Chinese violence during the Mexican Revolution as crucial to producing a revolutionary Mexican identity rather than reflecting some pre-existing national identity or being the result of some free-floating xenophobia. However, Peloso ignores the fact that Afro-Peruvians don't just attack the Chinese, they attack an entire plantation complex that included multiple estates. He also ignores the parallel fact that most Chinese victims in Cañate are coolies with their own long history of attacking the plantation system. If killing Chinese men inscribed new forms of Peruvian belonging, African descendant people aggressively challenged the power of Peru's white oligarchs. The pressure to read sources on the War of the Pacific in terms of nationalism undermines our understanding of the contested racial dynamics within national formations and, very importantly, the ways that plantation violence were always politically articulated rather than some kind of natural outcome of competition between racial groups. Chinese accounts of the Cañate violence pointedly avoided blaming Peruvian nationalism or Black people as a group. In 1884, just months after the war ended and the Chileans go home, a committee of 8 Chinese subjects from Cañate sent a 5-page letter to the newly established Chinese legation in Lima, demanding that the new Peruvian government impose the death penalty on the perpetrators of the mass murder in Cañate in 1881. This letter is signed by Quan Chi Lu and 7 other Chinese men who either witnessed the attacks or interviewed survivors. The account specified that 1,401 Chinese people were killed between February and June 1881 and provided a precise numerical breakdown for 6 plantations and 4 towns. This makes Cañete by far the most lethal anti-Chinese attack ever reported anywhere in the Americas. Quan Chi Lu and his fellows emphasized that the assailants were mostly peasants, campesinos, or interchangeably, native sons, hijos del país, who became enraged over an innocuous conflict between a black woman and a local Chinese merchant. Now, given Juan de Arona's monopoly on the story, it's worth sharing the Chinese version of the Cañete massacre in detail. And I quote from the Chinese letter. "The tragedy began with carnival, where one of the many traditions is throwing water on each other. A black woman threw water on a Chinaman and soaked his new clothes, producing a heated quarrel between him and the woman that the Peruvian peasants took advantage of to indulge in malevolent instincts. Within moments, 2 black men with rifles in hand appeared and threatened us and demanded we open our residences, which we closed just in time to save our lives. Soon we heard the ringing of bells, and armed peasants surrounded us, firing guns. The violence continued the entire night with such ardor that all Chinese establishments were set ablaze. The next day, the barbarians extended their bloody operations to the rest of the haciendas. We were workers earning our bread by the force of our labor, and we cannot comprehend how, having always lived in peace with our neighbors, the native sons, los hijos del país, among whom we know not one enemy, a single dispute could serve as motive to enrage people to commit such abominable crimes." It's heartbreaking, that last part. In leading with a story about offended honor, Chinese acknowledged gender and racial conflict between Black and Chinese people. A Black woman insults a Chinese man, and Black men collectively respond to what were likely retaliatory Chinese insults against the woman. However, the account does not attribute murderous acts to Africanness or Black women's depravity. On the contrary, it emphasized that playful water fights were part of the carnival tradition, and that Chinese men had always gotten along well with their neighbors, including women, some of whom are their wives. The term barbarian referred to those who killed Chinese with such ardor, not an inherent quality of Peruvian peasants. Moreover, Chinese inclusion of Black people within the category hijos del país, a term more common for indigenous people, ascribed a national legitimacy to African heritage that was denied by Peruvian oligarchs. Juan de Arona never calls Black people hijos del país, native sons. Quan Chi Lu and his fellows expressed wrenching bewilderment at why Peruvian peasants would suddenly turn on hardworking Chinese. But they were clear that the broader attack that followed the initial conflict was not spontaneous. It was coordinated and led by local Peruvian police and army officers loyal to Peru's supreme commander, supreme leader, Nicolás de Pierola. So this is a similar argument to what we saw in Lima. Nicolás de Pierola had encouraged assaults on plantations whose owners shirked obligations to fund the army. And by February 1881, Cañete was the site of multiple Peruvian guerrilla forces, montoneras, that organized after the fall of Lima to fight the Chilean occupation. These paramilitary groups were comprised of local residents, women and men, recent soldiers and camp followers, in the very army that landowners had so disastrously refused to fund. Guerrilla groups were led by regional strongmen with ties to Pierola, and his continued resistance to the Chileans from the highlands. I mean, after the fall of Lima, Pierola goes to Ayacucho, sets up a new government, and this man, Andrés Cáceres, will lead a resistance, but actually the folks who are really leading the resistance from the highlands are these massive uprisings by indigenous Andeans. This is really well known. What's not well known are the story of black guerrillas on the coast. When Chilean troops arrive in Cañete in June 1881 to put down the violence, they report battling guerrillas with Peabody rifles, the signature gun of the Peruvian army. Chileans noted that many of the enemy combatants are black and had converted local haciendas into military fortresses whose primary purpose was fighting Chileans and rival Peruvian factions, not killing Chinese. Peruvian guerrilla forces remained highly active in Cañete throughout the rest of the war, challenging Chilean authority more consistently than anywhere else on the Peruvian coast. In fact, when Chileans finally leave when the war is over in 1884, large parts of Cañete are still under guerrilla control. So given this dynamic, Juan de Arona's story of sadistic black women and men slaughtering Chinese men in cold blood covers up a more central truth, that armed resistance to Chilean occupation is being led on the coast by black people. De Arona himself admitted that almost all whites left the area and that landowners finally paid the Chileans to save their property. Evidently, the manumitted slaves, his term, proved much more steadfast patriots. The violence that claimed as many as 1,400 lives, Chinese lives, in Cañete stemmed from protracted months of fighting between Peruvian guerrillas and Chinese plantation workers in the context of wartime resistance and partisan racial class conflict. It was not a single day's rampage of Black on Asian murder. Chinese men organized their own strong martial defense. According to the letter by Quan Chi Lu, when things first turned ugly on Hacienda Casablanca, more than 200 Chinese from neighboring estates showed up to rescue them with knives and guns. Thereafter, the Chinese regrouped into two gangs, 200 strong each, on neighboring plantations that they converted into fortresses, and from which they used homemade bombs, catapults, and rifles against their attackers. Chinese paramilitary actions had a longer history in Peru, tied to coolie uprisings on plantations, which during the War of the Pacific become more closely linked to Chilean invasion. By 1881, coolie revolts had become key to replacing the 8-year coolie contract to a single Peruvian master with short-term subcontracts that are basically overseen by Chinese labor bosses, themselves former coolies. During the war, coolies took advantage of the Chilean invasion to flee plantations in droves, but often returned months later to the same estates to offer their labor through Chinese subcontractors in return for higher wages. Landowners, desperate to prevent labor flight and often lacking the ability to enforce the 8-year coolie contract, often accommodated these demands. And this was certainly the dynamic in Cañete. In December 1880, so before the fall of Lima, Chilean commander Patricio Lynch, this guy, marched troops through the Cañete Valley on his way to Lima, on his way to those battles. And in Cañete, Chinese rise up in mass, help the Chilean soldiers burn fields, loot houses, and 1,000 Chinese from Cañete actually attach themselves to Patricio Lynch's troops and follow him to Lima. After the fall of Lima, in fact, actually that earlier contingent of Chinese who fight with Chile, half of them come from Cañete. After the fall of Lima, a lot of those Chinese go back to Cañete, and they re-offer their labor to local plantations, either through Chinese subcontractors or sometimes as their own Chinese labor boss, because they had grabbed a few men together. Either way, when these men are coming back, and by February 1881, local memories among Black and indigenous Peruvians in Cañete of Chinese men having helped the Chilean enemy would have been fresh and surely stoked anti-Chinese feeling among peasants and guerrilla forces who then attacked Chinese people in February 1881. The Chinese letter by Quan Chi Lu and his fellows made no mention of coolie rebellion in Cañete or Chinese assistance to the Chilean army. That strategic silence conveniently ignored the distinction between Chinese workers and the Chinese merchants who increasingly controlled subcontracting. More fundamentally, it covered up how Chinese merchant labor bosses benefited from connections to the Chilean army. Most Chinese men whom Chileans claimed to rescue in Cañete and March to Liberty and Pisco ended up subcontracted on plantations in Pisco in their new home. The Chilean commander in Pisco, this guy, Estanislao del Canto, described surveying estates about their labor needs right after the Chinese refugees who had survived Cañete arrive. He discussed the terms of labor with Chinese bosses, and then, in his words, he engaged in a repartimiento, or distribution, of more than 3,000 Chinese and their labor bosses to local plantations. Strikingly, Del Canto used the verb repartir, a term associated with repartimiento, the Spanish crown's distribution of indigenous labor to conquistadors in return for political loyalty. And the Chilean commander, Del Canto, emphasized that Peruvian landowners in the area were elated with his reparto de los chinos, offering to pay him a personal bonus and thereafter cooperating with the Chilean governance. However, Del Canto made it clear that Chinese labor bosses, not the Peruvian landowners, would be the ones in charge of enforcing the terms of contract. The nexus between Chinese merchants and Chinese subcontracting predated Chile's invasion, but it was greatly strengthened by the way that the war increased Chinese bargaining power relative to plantation owners. Chinese merchants in Lima were especially active subcontractors. That's something that's completely ignored in the Chinese account of the massacre in Lima. Chinese labor operations expanded during Chilean occupation, prompting the British ambassador, Spencer St. John, to denounce the proliferation of what he called a new Chinese slave trade run by Chinese thugs. Yet Chinese subcontracting was not coolie labor. Chinese subcontracts indentured men for much shorter periods, 6 months, maybe a year, paid much higher wages, and most importantly, obligated workers not to a Peruvian master, but to fellow Chinese who often functioned as patrons in other social relationships. By the 1890s, Chinese-controlled subcontracting accounted for over half of Peruvian plantation labor and became the basis for an expanding Chinese merchant class across Peru. Okay, by way of conclusion, I want to quickly note the relationship between the stories about Lima and the stories about Cañete. All of these narratives about Chinese massacre obscure the issue of plantation labor, the very reason why so many Chinese people are in Peru. The more copious and sensationalist Chilean accounts about Peruvian mobs killing Chinese in Lima covered up Chilean responsibility for violence in Cañete and the Chilean army's role in redistributing Chinese workers to plantations through Chinese subcontracting. Most Peruvian commentators also had more to say about Lima than about what went on in Cañete. Denouncing Chilean savagery or casting Chinese men as traitors to Peru detracted from the fact that Peruvian oligarchs collaborated with the Chilean army to secure Chinese labor and to protect their property from Afro-Peruvian guerrillas who were fighting the Chilean occupation. Chinese narratives about both Lima and Cañete made no mention of wartime rebellions by coolies or the expanding role of Chinese merchants as labor bosses. Interestingly, only Juan de Arona's racist tale of blacks and Chinese fighting it out on Hacienda Casablanca brought the entire plantation system into focus and suggested that the violence was about challenging the basis of white oligarchic power. Now, de Arona purposely ignored the fact that Chinese workers also attacked white property in Cañete. This would undermine his argument about black depravity. But perhaps no one understood the national political stakes and class dynamics of racial violence better than a Peruvian landowner. Narratives about Chinese massacre in Lima and Cañete need to be understood as an intertwined history of political struggle. As stories about gender, race, and violence, the accounts articulated competing national claims. Chilean stories about crazed black women killing helpless Chinese men underscored Peru's barbarity and failure as a republic, in contrast to the masculine heroism of Chileans as a racially superior and civilized nation that liberated Asian slaves and brought order to chaos. Conversely, Peruvian elites used stories about Chinese massacre to argue that Chileans were savage and dishonorable men, or to descry the sins of Nicolás de Pierola and his black supporters. Narratives like Juan de Arona reiterated the idea about African depravity and denied the possibility of black patriotism. Chinese accounts of violence strived to defend Chinese men's honor and entitlement to justice. They insisted on the integrity of Chinese labor and enterprise in Peru, the illegitimacy of bigotry, and Chinese men's right to self-defense. Connecting the narratives about violence in Lima to those about Cañete suggests new understandings of what actually happened. In both places, Chinese men were attacked by Peruvian soldiers and civilians because of specific crises caused by Chilean invasion and longer patterns of racism and exploitation by Peruvian authorities. In Lima, Chinese shopkeepers and small vendors suffered extensive property destruction and numerous deaths amid a wartime food and financial crisis. Vastly more Chinese died in Cañete, where agrarian class conflicts merged with explosive divisions between Peruvian guerrillas and Chinese forces. Chinese men vigorously defended themselves, both as part of Lima's urban guard and in those paramilitary gangs on Cañete haciendas. As such, Chinese men also killed Peruvians. Both urban and rural violence stemmed from racist ideologies and divisions of labor that undergirded Peru's plantation system and oligarchic wealth. This included the foundational role of African slavery and forced indigenous labor, as well as the post-emancipation use of Chinese coolies to perpetuate coerced labor and land monopolies. Peruvian authorities' systematic abuse of Chinese men was rooted more in the coolie trade's elaboration of Chinese subhumanity than it was a resentment of the Chinese as foreign businessmen. Likewise, lethal conflict between Peruvian peasants and Chinese men in Cañete was shaped not by a perpetual animosity between blacks and Asians, but by the way that Chinese resistance to coolie labor through the expansion of Chinese-controlled subcontracting strategically linked Chinese freedom to Chilean invaders at the very moment when black and indigenous challenges to oligarchic power were manifested through guerrilla resistance to those invaders. A larger point I want to leave you with here is that understanding Chinese communities in Peru or elsewhere in the Americas really requires a robust re-engagement with labor as a dynamic social formation. Labor is not some background context for more operative racial antagonisms. It's not some structure that automatically creates competition and therefore violence. Rather, labor is a central terrain of political struggle that generates gendered and racial meanings. Narrative sources and discursive analysis are crucial to unveiling the intricacy of labor's meanings and the way that racial violence is always politically articulated. Narrative is also important to situating Chinese people within Latin American history, not as some interesting side story to the main event, but as central, in this case, to how Chileanness and Peruvianness were understood and contested in a war that dramatically remade South American nations. Thank you.
Professor Tinsman, so this talk is brilliant. I'm ethnically Chinese, but never heard of the story. So my question is, how do you even approach the subject or discover it from the books on the shelves?
Well, it's not really in the books on the shelf. I mean, these stories are in the books, 19th century books, 19th century histories, right? So many times who are the journalists who covered the war, they talk about, I mean, my point is that actually, although in the 20th century, because Latin American studies, at least in the North Atlantic and the US, ignores, it's as if Asia is irrelevant to what Latin America is, there isn't a lot of 20th century historiography on the Chinese in Latin America. Now, I'm exaggerating, of course. There was actually really important work done in the 80s on labor history in particular, certainly not on these massacres. There's been great work by Peruvians in Spanish on the Chinese. However, these particular stories about massacre during the war, these are all over the place in the actual documents of the 19th century, all right? It's we, the historians of the 20th and 21st century, that have said like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Wow, look, there were a bunch of Chinese there, but let's go on to the main story, right? The other place I find that it's in the archives. Now, I do not have Chinese language skills, right? And I'm often asked, oh, how do you do that? I'm writing a book now on masculinity and Chinese labor in the making of 19th century Peru and Chile, all right? And I'm not using Chinese language sources, not because they're not important, although in this particular moment in time, there is no Chinese legation. The Chinese embassies don't. The first legation, formal legation in Latin America is in Peru in 1884. And so Chinese in Latin America, and they're huge in Peru, huge in Cuba, also in what will become northern Chile and in Mexico, they use foreign embassies, particularly the British, and also the Americans. So British and American archives and Peruvian foreign relation archives are full of Chinese letters. And Chinese men used translators. They couldn't write in Cantonese to the Peruvian minister of government. They found someone who could write in Spanish for them, or later some of them wrote in Spanish themselves. So there's actually a lot of Chinese sources in Peruvian archives and in Chilean archives in the 19th century. So that's part of it. But what first alerted me to this was that the Chileans and the Peruvians and the British are talking about the Chinese, right? They talk about them all the time. The Chileans occupied the city of Lima for 3 years. Can you imagine? I mean, the United States doesn't occupy Mexico City for 3 years in the Mexican-American War. 3 years. And there are tons of Chilean memoirs about, oh, my time in Lima. And they're all about race, and different kinds of class and national conflicts. The Chileans talk a lot about experiences in the Barrio Chino, in the Chinese district. They talk about their relationships with Afro-Peruvians. That's in these sources, right? It's whatever. Thank goodness 19th century history is, in Latin America has made this happy expansion to be much more interested in the kind of social and cultural histories rather than the political history that dominated it for so long, because it's all over the sources. And there are some Chinese sources as well. I'm actually going to China with a translator soon. But in general, the Chinese state isn't there. So the kinds of records that you would get like sent back to China, that's not happening, not for these people. The coolies are slaves. They're not getting letters back home. So.
Well, thank you. It takes a brilliant historian to
find it. I build on the shoulders of many people, so there is exciting new. Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed the talk. There's actually a lot of, I can think of 10 books that have come out in the last 5 years that are superb about the centrality of Chinese people to the creation of Latin America and to debates about Latin American citizenship. I recommend Elliot Young's Alien Nation, Jason Chang's Chino, Kathleen Lopez, Chinese Cubans. There is now, thank God, Asian American studies has become more transnational. And China historians are also more interested in looking at Latin American studies. So.
Questions?
Ken.
If you can maybe say something about how is our understanding of the development of Peru and Chile, in this era of their history, how is it distorted by our lack of understanding of the events that you're talking about here? It's basically the neglect of this particular history and the complexities that you talked about. So you talk a little bit about how there are certain narratives that develop about the Peruvian and Chilean nationalism, but ultimately, how do we misunderstand development in these countries at this time period through our neglect of this history?
Well, if I can caricature the historiography, which is what we get, the War of the Pacific is both in Peru and in Chile, and by at least some historians who work in the North Atlantic on that war. It's a story about Indians and whites. It's a story about, Peru's Indian, right? I mean, African Peruvians get completely written out of the story, totally out of the story. And the war is, until the, protracted fights in the Andes against indigenous forces, which some historians have. Florencia Malin's work's been really important. There's great Peruvian historiography on the indigenous resistance, but in general, the war happens on the coast. The war is kind of over in terms of Chile's control of Peru by the time Lima is taken, and that's a bit of a controversial statement, but in some ways. The main battles of the war are fought on the coast, and the Peruvians who are fighting that war are at least 50% African descendant, also indigenous, right? So it's much more, also Chinese. There are actually Chinese who are, impressed by the Peruvian army to dig trenches, whatever, but we actually see Chinese fighting with the Chileans in a pattern that's, kind of not unlike in the U.S. Civil War, as the Union Army advances, Black people liberate themselves. It's not the Chileans who are liberating the Chinese. It's like the Chinese are like, we're going to take our already existing tradition of revolt and parlay that into a much more successful political happening. So I think it makes this not a Indian white story. It makes I'm not here to apologize for the Chileans, as a historian of Chile, right? But the story of the Chinese renders the story of Chile in Peru more complex. If you actually really look at what plantation owners are doing to Chinese people in the 19th century, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, it is extreme. The conditions are built directly upon the institution of slavery. So, and of course, other forms of so-called free labor are not free, heavily coerced, right? So now the War of the Pacific the War of the Pacific creates a civil war in Peru, and there had already been other civil war in Peru. So what this kind of methodology does is remind us that, this war is always also a civil war in Peru. Right? A civil war in which Black and indigenous communities are very much standing up to white oligarchic power. Now, sometimes they have white caudillos and different coalitions and alliances. It's not like, groups of Blacks, groups of Indians, groups of whites. But that kind of power structure, because the political power in Peru in the 19th century is held by the men who own the large plantations. Sugar plantations are the basis of oligarchic wealth, and that's being challenged not just by the Chileans who want to come in and grab their nitrate territory. It's being challenged by Chinese too. It's just the Chinese in this particular instance are fighting on different sides. There's other episodes where Chinese fight in Peruvian guerrilla groups in the Andes. So, but I'm actually not. I'm not. But so yeah, it renders it much more. I think the point isn't just to make it more racially inclusive. It's to underscore that how this violence is politically articulated. I'm a labor historian. I don't have structure is certainly useful. I'm not against structure, right? But we have to think of it as this always contested human political process, right? And so the racial violence that's happening, say, in Cañete is politically articulated through these guerrilla groups that are allied loosely with Nicolás de Pierola, kind of early or kind of 19th century populist, and definitely authoritarian, right? But that doesn't mean that African descendant Peruvians don't use him for their own purposes, right? To challenge the white plantation owners. There's that civil war. And then, of course, there's the political articulation through Chile. So I don't want to read it just the way labor historians would do it in the 19th century, in the 1980s. We're not that old. Would be like, this is labor conflict, right? The Chinese have the jobs, the blacks want the jobs, therefore they fight. And it's like, well, actually, usually they don't fight. Usually they don't fight at all. Usually they're eating together, they're borrowing from each other, they're having common law marriages. No, actually, they're mostly not killing each other. So when they do kill each other, why, right? So.
Yeah, a question about sources. So
I'm sorry, sources? Okay.
Yeah, about your sources for the Afro-Peruvians.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you obviously did a wonderful talk in giving us all the different voices and narratives about the different sources. But I'm wondering, in terms of, and maybe I missed it, but did you have a challenge in terms of getting to the Afro-Peruvian sources in terms of it seems like you have more material.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, you're so perceptive. It's absolutely true. The kind of okay, where do I have an Afro-Peruvian source, right? Showing us what did this conflict mean to them, or what about their and no, I don't have that for this talk. That doesn't mean they don't exist, okay? And the same sources that we read. I certainly, my reading of this, the sources say that, all of the sources say the same thing, which is that, Black people have always hated the Chinese and they go and they kill them. No source say these are Black guerrilla fighters who are basically, organizing in the same pattern that we see guerrilla forces organizing in the Andes, right? So that's me using that technique of reading against the grain, right? Saying, no, this isn't just about Black-Asian conflict that's always there because the plantation structures it. This is the same political process, right? So I'm claiming Black agency in guerrilla groups. Also, there's quite a bit of Chilean discussion of Afro-Peruvians or imagined African descendant communities in those sources. So a lot of the same sources and a lot of the sources I use for the Chinese are not like kind of Chinese voices. They're, how can we use these sources to get at a particular politics or make reasonable claims about identity or reason. So I guess the place that I would look, I'm actually not writing a book on the war. This is one chapter, although it doesn't, and it's in process. So the place that I will think more about looking is the same place I found discussions about Black and Chinese people from the Chilean side, which are in these soldiers' memoirs, right? So not because there's lots of, literate Peruvians running around leaving their memoirs. It's usually officers who write. But again, the information, many times those narratives can be very useful to arguing for from an Afro-Peruvian community perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't challenged, I was just curious about.
No, it's like the voices I'm putting are, here I have my white oligarchs from Peru, my Chilean, my Chileans, and I'm looking at Chilean elites, right? The wider piece looks at, the Chilean army is full of African and indigenous descendant people. There are many Chilean commanders who consider the Chilean soldiers completely indigenous. They make that very clear, and certain sectors of them to be Black as well. All right, so I'm definitely trying to challenge the idea that somehow, Chileans are this vaguely white people that have always kind of been a homogenous Chilean. That's a product of the victory of the War of the Pacific, and then 20th century historiographies that, it doesn't even apply to Chile today. You come to Chile, and that's actually not what raza chilena means to most people. But yeah, our elite, not unlike when we do colonial history, it's like our claims about indigenous subjectivity in politics are often, through elite sources.
I'm Peruvian, so so this is super interesting to me. When you go to school, they kind of explain the War of the Pacific, and they never talk about the role of the Chinese. Most accounts about Peruvian and Chinese relationships tend to, I think, use this point about there being more cooperation and more fusion between the groups.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested, and so if that's the mainstream of the accounts that I have seen, and the passage that you mentioned about the heartbreaking passage of these Chinese people saying that,
saying that how can people we've always got along with suddenly attack us?
So I'm interested in the sort of reconciliation between that, if there's some sort of account of the Chinese reconciliation and how did they became part of Peruvian citizenship. If there's something, you're exploring that also?
That's actually not, that is not, that's not a large part of what my study does. However, since I'll kind of be ending after the war in the 80s and the 90s, most of these Chinese stay, all of these Chinese stay, right? The idea that the Chinese go back to China, they don't go back to China. They're basically, they're in a form of slave labor, and the kinds of merchants they become are petty vendors. Most of them end up as part of Peruvian society or part of Chilean society, right? So I do actually my ending chapter will be looking at the insertion of, the new formations of Chinese Latin Americanness within Peru and within Chile in the 1880s. Now, there is some great scholarship by Peruvians in Peru on the Chinese in Peru. In fact, the biggest whatever, my biggest intellectual debts are to Peruvian intellectuals who, beginning in the 1970s and 80s, really looked at this. Humberto Rodriguez Pastor did really important work on Chinese plantation labor and Chinese becoming Peruvian citizens in the 80s. There's now a plethora of studies in Spanish that have been published in the last, say, 15 years. And a lot of it, they all know the story of the Cañete massacre, but not so much Cañete. They all know the story of the Chinese who collaborated with Chile, because that circulated as part of broader, anti-Chinese racism in Peru in the 20th century. There's, virulent forms of anti-Chinese racism that continue to, or whatever, that newly formed in Peru throughout the 20th century. And one of the things that will be whipped up into a sensationalist story always is this idea of the collaboration between the Chinese with the Chileans, right? So there's been a attempt to unpack that and contextualize it as happening in a very specific place, in a very specific context. But the great work that came out of labor history and anthropology in the 1980s and 90s really did a lot of work on the Chinese and kind of claimed the Chinese as the Peruvian working class. Anyway, I'm happy to talk to you more about that literature, but it's the folks who worked on this first are Peruvians, Peruvian intellectuals. So, and in part, that intellectual academic act itself was about, in the 70s and the 80s, very much not wanting to participate in, reiterating these narratives of Chinese betrayal of the Peruvian nation.
Yeah, I have two questions. I was wondering if you could speak more on Latin America the history of Latin America being told as not part of the Pacific. How did that happen? Why, in a specific moment, did it kind of get severed off and disappeared from the Pacific world? And maybe how your project helps to, I could see some ways it helps, but what are some steps we could take to kind of fix this? And then I'm really interested in, towards the end of your talk, about kind of the mobility of former coolies and this renegotiation, right? How does that challenge the power of taking someone and transporting them to, however far away from their homes? And it's not so remote, right? They figure out networks and they figure out ways to kind of grapple with local conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially after following a revolt. Right. I mean, the kinds of revolts that happened with the Chinese during the War of the Pacific, Chinese revolts are happening all the time, every year, from the start of the coolie trade in the 1840s through its, whatever, it kind of peters out at the end of the 1880s. So anyway, Latin American studies question, I of course have to speak in broad shorthand that, won't make everybody happy, but Latin American studies as it was formed in the United States does predate the Cold War. However, it's given major institutional heft and financing, post-45, and its mission from U.S. academic institutions funded by the State Department, blah, 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 blah. The mission is to look at Latin America in its relationship to the United States, to judge, who measures up for the potential of capitalist democracy, where there are troubles, right? The field of Latin American studies has always been international, but it has prioritized looking at relationships to the U.S., obviously relationships to Europe with colonialism, and if you're talking about slaves, maybe a little bit about Africa, but only if you're talking about slaves. Otherwise, you can ignore Africa. It's structured as a separate entity. So this is, a kind of Anglo-American centrism of what Latin America is, right? Now Latin American intellectual groups have their own formations, and depending on what time period you're talking about, in the 1960s and 70s, the Latin American intellectuals in the Latin American left are talking a lot about China. right, actually, and they're visiting China, and they're talking a lot about the Vietnam War, they're talking, whatever, so they don't necessarily think of themselves as having connections. And as I said, the scholarship, there's scholars in the 70s who are busy working on the Chinese in Peru, right? So I think, so when I talk about invoke Latin American studies, ignoring, right, or being set up, right? And of course, Latin American studies emerges at the same moment that other area studies are being funded in the post-45 context by the US, areas of the world, right? We need to understand, we, the United States, need to understand the regions of the world that we're now going to lead. So there is, South Asian studies departments, there's East Asian studies departments, and this is problematic for all regions, right? Anybody who, works on 20th century China knows that there's so much traffic going on between Russia and China, for Pete's sake. You really need to be trained in both the Russian language and in Mandarin, if you're going to be doing 20th century, blah, 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 right? That's not, if you're working in the US Academy and, British Academy too, I think that's changing. I think it's changing a lot. I'm not the first person to be working on Latin America's relationship with Asia. But I do think it changes it, right? And not just because look, I'm working on Chinese bodies that came from another part of the Pacific. It's, it's engagement with, historiographies from China. In other chapters, I rely on a lot of history of the late 19th century Qing dynasty to interpret what's going on with Chinese communities, right? Or I have a chapter on the coolie trade, the Pacific voyage, right? The Pacific Passage from the auction block in Hong Kong and Macau over to the auction block in Macau. So there's challenges, of course. Some projects, it suggests we should be open to new forms of language training. It's never too late to learn a language, though. I've actually been taking Mandarin for a year. So not because I think in this particular case, my sources are in Spanish and English. They really are. That's what they're writing in. But because I'm now happily getting invited to conferences in China, and there's whatever. Asia, too, is busy developing its own area studies right now, formulated in a very different way that is interesting, right? And I think we'll see a lot more trans-Pacific conversations going on.
I think we're more or less out of time-ish, but you should stick around. We have a little reception in the room next door here. Before we head there, I want to thank Professor Tinsman for a great talk.
Thank you.